I still remember the exact moment I stood at my front door after being discharged from the hospital, my body still weak from emergency surgery, fresh stitches pulling painfully under my skin with every small movement, and my hospital discharge, folder pressed tightly against my chest like it was the only thing holding me together. I expected pain. I expected exhaustion. But what I did not expect was my own mother looking me dead in the eyes and telling me to stop being dramatic and get back into the kitchen to cook dinner. And what made it even worse wasn't just what she said. It was how normal it felt to everyone else in that room. My father didn't react. My brother laughed. And in that exact moment, I realized something terrifying. I wasn't returning home. I was returning to a place where my suffering had no meaning at all. But what my family didn't know was that someone else had just stepped into that doorway. Someone they had underestimated for years. And by the end of that night, the balance of power in that house was going to collapse completely. Before we go any further, if you've ever been ignored when you were hurting, dismissed when you needed help, or treated like your value only comes from what you do for others, then stay with this story until the end. And if you believe people like this eventually get what they deserve, hit the like button, subscribe, and prepare yourself. Because what happens next is one of the most satisfying reversals you will ever hear. My name is Adrienne Foxwell, and I was 23 years old when I finally understood that my home wasn't really a home at all. It was a system. A system where my value was measured only by how much I could carry, clean, cook, and tolerate without breaking. From the outside, our house in a quiet neighborhood near Charlotte, North Carolina, looked perfect. Clean driveway, polished windows, trimmed hedges, the kind of home people assume belongs to a stable, respectful family. But inside those walls, nothing worked the way it looked from the outside. My mother, Valerie Foxwell, ruled the house without ever lifting a finger herself. She didn't call it control, she called it managing the household, but in reality, she managed nothing except criticism. Every small thing I did was never enough, never fast enough, never good enough. If I cleaned, she pointed out what I missed. If I cooked, she told me I should have done it earlier. If I rested, she treated it like an offense. My brother Preston lived like responsibility didn't exist for him. 26 years old, unemployed, always glued to his gaming headset, acting like the world owed him comfort while he contributed nothing to the home except noise, mess, and sarcasm. He mocked me constantly, especially when I was tired, as if exhaustion was something I chose for attention, and my father, Howard Foxwell, he was the quietest part of the entire system. He never defended me, never stopped anything, never took a side. He just existed in the background, pretending that silence was neutrality when in reality, it was permission. I was a nursing student, working part-time at a pharmacy, trying to build a future that felt like it belonged to me. But every time I walked through that front door, that future disappeared under a new list of demands. Dishes, laundry, cleaning, cooking, errands. And somehow, it was always assumed that I would handle everything without complaint. Because in that house, my exhaustion wasn't real. It was inconvenient. About a week before everything collapsed, I started feeling a strange pain on my lower right side. At first, I ignored it. I convinced myself it was stress, bad posture, maybe something I ate. That's what you do when you're trained to keep going no matter what, even when your body starts warning you to stop. But the pain didn't stop. It got worse. Each night it became sharper, deeper, more unbearable, until even standing in the kitchen felt like something was tearing inside me. One evening, I had to grab the counter just to stay upright, my vision slightly blurring from the pain. That was when my mother finally looked up from her phone. Not with concern, with irritation. "Stop with the dramatic breathing," she said flatly. "Season the chicken before 6. That was it. Not, 'Are you okay?' Not, Do you need help? Just more work. My brother walked past, saw me bent over in pain, and laughed under his breath. She's faking it again, he said casually, like my suffering was a running joke in the house. And my father, he saw everything and chose nothing. That night I burned dinner because I physically couldn't stay standing long enough to finish cooking. My mother didn't ask what was wrong. She didn't check on me. She just looked at the ruined pot and said I was irresponsible and made everything harder for everyone else. I apologized, even then, because that was the role I had been trained to play. But the next few days, the pain became impossible to ignore. I tried to keep going, tried to function, tried to pretend it wasn't serious, until one night my body finally gave up on asking for permission. The pain hit me like something snapping inside my abdomen. I collapsed in the hallway, barely able to breathe, barely able to move. I called my mother first. No answer. My father next. Voicemail. My brother rejected the call, and when I texted the family group chat saying I thought something was seriously wrong, my mother replied that I should stop trying to get attention because they were eating dinner. My brother sent a laughing emoji and told me if I could text, I could clean. My father said nothing at all. That silence was the moment everything changed, because I finally understood something I had refused to accept for years. I wasn't part of their priorities, I was part of their convenience. And that night, while my body was shutting down, I made a decision that led me straight to a hospital, and straight into the moment that would change everything I thought I knew about my family. By the time I reached the hospital, I was no longer walking like a normal person. My body was folded over itself in pain, every movement sending sharp waves through my abdomen like something inside me was tearing apart completely. I remember the hospital lights feeling too bright, too clean, almost cruel in contrast to how broken I felt inside. Nurses immediately rushed me into a wheelchair without asking many questions because my face alone was enough to tell them this wasn't something minor. Everything after that moved in fragments. Blood pressure cuffs tightening around my arm, cold hands pressing against my stomach, urgent voices becoming more serious with every passing second. And then came the words I wasn't ready to hear. Acute appendicitis, risk of rupture, emergency surgery required immediately. It didn't feel real at first, like I was listening to someone else's life being described instead of mine. But then they placed the consent form in front of me and asked me to sign, and I realized there was no time left to deny it. Before they took me in, I sent one message to my mother, telling her I was in the hospital and going into surgery, asking her to inform my father. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely type, but I still pressed send because some part of me still believed that hearing I was in surgery would make them care, even just a little. The response came almost immediately, and it hit harder than the pain in my body. My mother replied that I should stop embarrassing myself and that we would talk when I got home, as if emergency surgery was something I had chosen for attention. My brother followed it with a message asking who would be cleaning tomorrow, as if my condition was an inconvenience in his schedule rather than a medical emergency. My father, the one person I still held some fragile hope for, sent only 3 words: listen to doctors. No call, no urgency, no I'm coming, just a detached instruction as if I had informed him about a routine appointment instead of life-threatening surgery. When I woke up after the operation, everything felt distant and heavy. My throat was raw, my stomach felt like it had been stitched together from the inside, and every breath reminded me that my body had been cut open and repaired without anyone from my family even being there. A nurse explained that the surgery had gone well, but I needed rest, no physical strain, and strict recovery. Then she asked who would be picking me up when I was discharged. I remember staring at the ceiling for a moment because I didn't have an answer. That question should have been simple: a mother, a father, a sibling, someone, anyone. But my phone, sitting beside the bed, lit up again with messages that made everything inside me go cold. My mother told me not to milk it and reminded me that they still had guests coming that weekend. That was the moment something inside me stopped expecting anything from them. What broke me wasn't the pain, it was the realization that my family didn't see me as someone who could suffer. They only saw someone who could function or be replaced. Even in a hospital bed recovering from surgery, my existence was still measured in usefulness. The next morning, everything shifted in a way I didn't expect. My closest friend Mina showed up at the hospital after I finally answered her call, and the moment she saw me lying there with IV lines and surgical dressings, her expression changed completely. She didn't ask unnecessary questions. She didn't hesitate. She simply sat beside me and stayed. When my phone rang again and my mother's name appeared on the screen, Mina picked it up before I could stop her and put it on speaker. My mother's voice filled the room immediately, irritated and impatient, asking if I was awake because the kitchen was unacceptable and Preston had nothing clean to wear. Mina looked at me like she couldn't believe what she was hearing, like she was trying to understand how someone could speak like that to a person who had just had surgery. I tried to explain, my voice weak, telling her I couldn't move properly, that I had just undergone an operation, but my mother cut me off, saying every woman has discomfort and that I shouldn't turn it into a performance. Mina didn't argue with her. She simply ended the call. The silence that followed felt heavier than the entire conversation. That was the moment Mina looked at me and said I wasn't going back there alone, and for the first time, instead of defending my family out of habit, I didn't have the energy to argue. It was also the moment I remembered someone I had almost forgotten to turn to, someone who had once told me that if I ever needed help when no one else would listen, I should call him directly. Sterling Westbrook wasn't technically a family member in the way people usually think, but he had known my grandmother and remained connected through legal and financial ties that my family always spoke about with discomfort. To them, he was distant and intimidating, someone they avoided unless absolutely necessary. To me, he had always been polite, but distant, until one conversation years ago when he quietly told me that if I ever found myself in a situation where I was not being heard, I should contact him without hesitation. Mina held out my phone and told me it was time. My hands were trembling so badly she had to help me dial. When he answered, his voice was calm but immediately alert. And the moment I explained that I was in hospital after emergency surgery, that I had been the only one managing household responsibilities for years while recovering alone, and that my family knew and still expected me to return home to cook, the line went silent in a way that felt more powerful than any reaction I had ever heard. When he finally spoke, his voice had changed completely. He told me to keep every message, to document everything, and not to warn anyone because he was coming immediately. And in that moment, lying in a hospital bed I couldn't even sit up properly in, I didn't know it yet, but something had already started moving that my family would not be able to stop. The hospital discharge process felt surreal, like I was being released back into a life that no longer made sense. My body was still weak, every step sending a dull but constant reminder through my stomach that I had been cut open only hours ago, yet I was being told to rest and recover as if rest was something I could actually find in the world I was returning. Mina stayed close to me the entire time, carrying my things, watching my every movement like she was afraid I might collapse if she looked away for even a second, while Sterling Westbrook handled everything with a quiet precision that made it clear he was not just there to help, he was there to observe. He didn't ask unnecessary questions, didn't express exaggerated concern, but instead focused on details. My discharge instructions, my medication schedule, the paperwork, every small administrative thing that most people ignore in moments like this. It felt less like I was being discharged and more like something was being documented carefully for later use. When everything was finally ready, Sterling insisted on driving me himself. I remember sitting in the back seat with a pillow pressed against my stomach, trying not to let every bump in the road remind me of the surgery, while Mina sat beside me silently, her presence steady and grounding in a way I didn't realize I desperately needed. Sterling drove without music, his attention fully on the road, but the tension in his posture wasn't from stress, it was from control. He wasn't emotional in the way my family was, loud or reactive. His silence was calculated, deliberate, like someone who had already decided what needed to be done and was simply waiting for the right moment to act on it. As we got closer to my house, I felt my stomach tighten for a completely different reason than the surgery. It wasn't physical pain anymore, it was anticipation. I knew what was waiting for me there. I knew my mother would not suddenly become caring. I knew my brother would not suddenly develop empathy. I knew my father would not suddenly find a spine. They would see me walk in and, in their minds, I would still be the same role I had always been. The one who fixes everything, regardless of her condition. Sterling didn't pull directly into the driveway. Instead, he parked a short distance away and turned off the engine. I looked at him confused, and he simply said that he wanted to see their real reaction, not their performance. That word stayed in my mind longer than I expected because it was exactly what my family did best: perform normalcy when it suited them, and ignore reality when it didn't. Mina helped me out of the car, staying close enough to catch me if I stumbled, while Sterling walked slightly behind us, observing everything like he was entering a situation he had already analyzed in advance. Each step toward the house felt heavier than the last, not just because of my physical condition, but because something inside me already knew this return would change everything. Through the windows, I could see movement inside, lights on in the kitchen, signs of a gathering that had clearly not been canceled despite everything that had happened to me. The smell of food and the sound of people talking faintly reached the front yard, and for a moment I almost felt detached from it all, like I was walking back into a life I used to belong to but no longer recognized. When I finally reached the front door, I hesitated for just a second, my hand hovering near the doorbell, but before I could press it, the door swung open. My mother stood there dressed neatly, composed as if she was preparing to host guests, rather than acknowledge a daughter returning from surgery. Her eyes passed over me quickly, landing briefly on my hospital folder before her expression tightened, in irritation instead of concern. And then she said it, the words that made everything inside me go cold, that I was finally back, and I should stop with the act and get dinner ready. For a second, I genuinely thought I misheard her, because the level of detachment in her voice didn't match reality. My brother appeared behind her almost immediately, holding a controller, laughing under his breath as if my condition was something amusing rather than serious. He added that I shouldn't fake exhaustion just to avoid responsibility, and that everyone knew I liked attention. My father stood slightly behind them, silent as always, his eyes briefly meeting mine before shifting away again, as if looking at me directly required acknowledgement he was unwilling to give. Something inside me sank, not dramatically, but quietly, like a system shutting down after too many warnings had been ignored. I felt my knees weaken slightly, not just from the surgery but from the realization that nothing had changed for them. I had come back expecting at least a pause, some recognition of what had happened to me, but instead I had walked into the same structure where my pain had no place at all. My mother then picked up an apron from the side and threw it toward me. It didn't land gently, it hit my arm and slid to the floor, and in that moment, something in me stopped reacting the way it used to. I didn't argue. I didn't explain. I didn't even have the energy to defend myself. I just stood there, holding onto the folder in my hand, feeling the weight of everything I had tolerated suddenly becoming unbearable. And that was when I heard footsteps behind me. Not from inside the house, from behind me. Sterling Westbrook stepped forward into the doorway, and the entire atmosphere shifted instantly. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, but it was immediate. The way people react when they suddenly realize a situation has consequences they didn't account for. My mother's expression changed first, confusion replacing irritation. My brother's smirk disappeared completely. My father straightened slightly, like instinctively reacting to someone he considered above him. Sterling didn't rush. He didn't raise his voice. He simply looked at the apron on the floor, then at my mother, and then at my brother, and asked in a calm but controlled tone if they had just ordered a woman who had left surgery that same day to cook dinner for them. The silence that followed wasn't empty, it was heavy, like the entire house was waiting for someone else to respond first, but no one did. My mother opened her mouth, but nothing came out. My brother shifted uncomfortably, suddenly unsure of himself. My father said nothing at all. Sterling stepped fully inside then, closing the door behind him with a soft click that somehow felt louder than any argument could have. And in that moment, I realized something I hadn't understood before. I wasn't just walking back into my home. I was walking into the beginning of its collapse. The moment Sterling closed the door behind him, the entire energy inside the house changed in a way that was almost physical. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic at first glance, but it felt like the air itself had become heavier, like the room had finally acknowledged that whatever game had been played here for years had just ended. My mother straightened her posture immediately, trying to regain control of the situation through appearance alone, the way she always did when guests were present or when she thought image still mattered. My brother shifted uncomfortably, suddenly, aware that his usual confidence didn't translate in front of someone like Sterling, and my father, as always, defaulted to silence. But this time even his silence felt different, less protective and more exposed. Sterling didn't sit down. He didn't greet anyone warmly. He simply looked at the space around him like someone evaluating a system that had been failing for a long time. Then his eyes settled on me for a brief moment, not with pity, but with confirmation, as if everything I had told him had already been enough to form a conclusion. After that, he turned his attention to my mother and asked again, calmly but firmly, if she had just ordered a woman who had undergone emergency surgery the same day to cook dinner. My mother tried to respond immediately, but her voice came out slightly unstable, attempting to sound confident but failing to hide the irritation underneath. She said it was a misunderstanding, that I was exaggerating my condition, that I always had a tendency to overreact to pain. Sterling didn't react to her explanation. Instead, he took out his phone and connected it to the television in the living room. The screen changed almost instantly, displaying messages, screenshots, and documents that none of them had expected to ever see outside of private conversations. My mother's text telling me to stop embarrassing myself after I informed her about surgery appeared first. My brother's message about who would be cleaning the next day followed it, casual and dismissive, like my medical emergency was a scheduling inconvenience. And then my father's message, the 3 words that had haunted me in a different way than anger ever could. Listen to doctors. The room didn't erupt immediately. It went quiet first, the kind of silence that happens when people realize they are no longer controlling the narrative. Sterling let that silence settle before speaking again. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't accuse anyone emotionally, he simply stated the facts. Adrienne had been in a hospital undergoing emergency surgery, and while that was happening, her family's concern was not her survival or recovery, but household chores and dinner arrangements. He paused just long enough for that reality to fully land before continuing. My mother immediately tried to interrupt, saying that the messages were taken out of context, that families joke, that stress sometimes makes people say things they don't mean. But Sterling calmly moved to the next set of documents, and the tone of the room shifted again. Medical discharge papers appeared on the screen, clearly showing instructions for rest, no physical strain, and recovery requirements. He read, Them out loud slowly, each line reinforcing what my body had already gone through. No lifting, no exertion, immediate recovery required. And then he looked directly at my brother and asked why someone would accuse a post-operative patient of faking exhaustion after receiving confirmation she had undergone surgery. My brother tried to defend himself, stumbling over words, saying, he didn't know it was that serious, that he thought I was exaggerating like I always did. But even as he spoke, his confidence was gone, replaced with something far less stable. Mina, who had been standing near me the entire time, let out a quiet laugh that wasn't humorous at all, just sharp and disbelieving, and for the first time, my brother looked genuinely annoyed but unsure how to respond. Then, Sterling moved to the financial records, and that was when everything shifted from emotional exposure to structural collapse. He displayed trust fund allocations, household expenses, medical allowances, and utility payments that had been managed through systems my father had access to. The numbers were precise, organized, and impossible to argue with. But next to those legitimate expenses were charges that told a completely different story: luxury home decor, expensive personal items, subscriptions, dining expenses, and purchases that had nothing to do with household necessity and everything to do with unchecked spending. My mother immediately reacted, her voice rising slightly as she tried to justify them as household improvements, necessary living costs, things that made the home presentable. But Sterling didn't argue emotionally. He simply highlighted one specific charge, a decorative purchase worth far more than anything that could be considered essential, and asked calmly who exactly benefited from it. The question didn't need an answer because the implication was already clear. Then he turned to my brother's records. Car expenses, fuel cards, insurance payments, electronic purchases, all covered through systems that were supposed to support legitimate household needs. But when compared to actual employment records, there was nothing. No stable income, no professional structure, nothing that justified the scale of support he was receiving. Sterling said it plainly, without insult or exaggeration, that my brother wasn't building a business, he was being financially enabled to avoid responsibility. That was when my brother snapped, raising his voice for the first time, saying that everyone was acting like I was perfect, like I didn't live there too, like I didn't contribute anything. His frustration wasn't fully directed at me. It was directed at the sudden exposure of imbalance he had never been forced to acknowledge. I heard my own voice before I fully decided to speak, calm but firm, saying that contribution means sharing responsibility, not carrying everything while others contribute nothing but criticism. The room went still again after that. My mother attempted one last shift, turning emotional instead of defensive. She said she had raised me properly, that discipline was important, that I needed to learn responsibility. But Sterling looked at her with an expression that didn't match anger or sympathy. It was closer to final judgment. He said a woman recovering from surgery does not need discipline. She needs care. And what had happened in this house was not discipline, it was neglect disguised as expectation. My father finally spoke, but only barely, his voice low as he admitted he should have gone to the hospital. It wasn't a defense, it was recognition, and for the first time, my mother turned on him instead, blaming him for allowing the system to continue, for choosing comfort over intervention. And in that moment, I realized something deeply uncomfortable. This wasn't just one person being cruel. It was an entire structure where everyone had played a role in maintaining silence. Sterling didn't allow the emotional collapse to drift. He closed the financial files and shifted into consequences. His voice remained steady as he announced that access to trust funds would be frozen pending review, household discretionary accounts suspended, and financial privileges reassessed. He didn't threaten, he simply executed decisions that had already been prepared. My brother immediately reacted in shock, saying it wasn't possible, but Sterling didn't respond to emotion, only to reality. It had already been done. The house, which had always functioned on invisible control systems that none of them questioned, suddenly no longer belonged to them in the way they thought it did. And as that realization spread through the room, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time, not happiness, not revenge, but something quieter and far more powerful. For the first time, I wasn't responsible for holding it all together, and it was only the beginning. By the next morning, the house didn't feel like the same place anymore. It still had the same walls, the same furniture, the same polished surface that used to fool people from the outside, but something essential had changed. It was no longer a system running on invisible control and quiet obedience. It had become a place where every action now had consequences, and for the first time, my mother, my brother, and even my father were forced to live inside the reality they had spent years ignoring. My mother was the first to feel it. She went through the motions of her usual routine, walking into the kitchen expecting things to function the way they always had, expecting groceries to appear, expecting cleanliness without effort, expecting order without contribution. But when she tried to use her trust card for her usual purchases, the transaction didn't go through. She tried again, slower this time, as if repetition could fix reality, but it still declined. I heard the faint sound of that notification from upstairs, that small electronic refusal, and something about it felt heavier than any argument the night before. For a moment, she just stood there, staring at the machine like it had betrayed her personally, not understanding that what she was experiencing wasn't punishment in the emotional sense, but the removal of systems she had never questioned. For years, everything had simply worked because someone else had been quietly maintaining it. Now that support was gone, and the structure she relied on was collapsing under its own weight. My brother experienced his shift differently. It didn't come through silence or confusion, it came through interruption. A truck arrived that morning with paperwork regarding the vehicle he had been driving for years. He argued loudly on the porch, his voice rising with frustration and disbelief, insisting there had to be a mistake, that he was entitled to it, that it couldn't just be taken away. But there was no mistake. The car wasn't his. The fuel, the insurance, the maintenance, all of it had been tied to systems that no longer supported him. And for the first time, he didn't have an excuse that held up outside the house. By midday, the comfortable version of his life had already started dissolving. The gaming setup he spent most of his time on suddenly felt irrelevant. The online identity he had built around being busy or working on something didn't translate into actual stability. And as the day went on, he started to realize something he had never been forced to confront before. When the support disappears, confidence built on dependence disappears with it. Inside the house, my mother moved differently too. She wasn't loud anymore. She wasn't commanding. She was calculating, trying to figure out how to restore what she thought was a temporary disruption. She went through cupboards, checked routines, opened spaces that used to function without her involvement, and slowly started realizing how much of her authority was actually outsourced labor. The house didn't respond to her anymore. It just existed, waiting for someone who would actually maintain it. My father was quieter than both of them. He didn't react with panic or anger. Instead, he moved through the house like someone who was finally seeing it clearly for the first time. That night, he came to my room and knocked before entering, which alone felt strange enough to make me pause. He looked tired in a way I hadn't seen before, not physically tired, but mentally stripped down. He told me he was sorry again, but this time it didn't feel like a reflex. It felt like recognition. Not of one mistake, but of years of avoidance, and I remember something inside me shifting at that moment. Not forgiveness, not immediately, but understanding that accountability and emotional repair are not the same thing, and that one can exist without rushing the other. Sterling didn't return to the house immediately after that night. Instead, he managed everything from a distance, like someone ensuring a system transitioned properly into a new structure. He had already moved the financial controls, initiated reviews, and placed temporary restrictions that ensured no one could simply revert back to old patterns. It wasn't dramatic, it was procedural, and that made it more irreversible than any argument could have been. For me, the change was quieter, but far more profound. I stayed in bed for a few days under medical recovery orders, but for the first time, I wasn't recovering in an environment that demanded something from me while I healed. Mina stayed with me as much as she could, helping me eat, reminding me to take medication, and sitting beside me without expecting anything in return. That alone felt unfamiliar, like a version of support I had never been allowed to experience properly before. Eventually, Sterling arranged for me to move out. Not in a dramatic escape, not in anger, but in a structured, intentional way. A small furnished apartment near my campus, simple but clean, stable in a way that didn't demand anything from me other than recovery and focus. When I first walked inside, I remember standing in the middle of it for a long time because I wasn't used to silence that didn't feel like pressure. There were no expectations waiting in the next room, no invisible checklist, no assumption that my existence was tied to service. My mother tried to reach me repeatedly during that period. At first, her messages were sharp, blaming me for what had happened, accusing me of betrayal, saying I had turned someone against the family. Then, when anger didn't bring a response, her tone shifted. It softened into emotional appeals, loneliness, regret framed in a way that still centered her experience rather than mine. I didn't respond immediately. Not because I wanted revenge in the traditional sense, but because I needed space to understand what my silence meant for the first time. My brother attempted contact less consistently. His messages were shorter, more reactive, usually centered around frustration or disbelief. But over time, even that faded, replaced by the reality of having to function without systems that had previously absorbed responsibility for him. My father stayed the most consistent in the smallest way possible. A message once a week, simple, restrained, never demanding a response. I am here when you are ready. It didn't erase anything, but it also didn't pressure me to define forgiveness on someone else's timeline. And slowly, something began to settle inside me that I didn't expect. Not revenge, not satisfaction in their downfall, but clarity. Because the truth was, nothing that happened to them was about destruction. It was about exposure. The system didn't break because someone attacked it. It broke because it was never stable in the first place. The real shift happened when I returned to my studies. Walking back onto campus, carrying my books, feeling my body slowly recover, I realized how different life felt when every action belonged to me. No interruptions, no hidden expectations, no emotional debt disguised as responsibility, just choice. And that was when I finally understood something that had taken me years of exhaustion, silence, and pain to learn. I was never weak. I was overburdened, in a system that depended on me not realizing my own value. The revenge wasn't loud. It wasn't explosive. It wasn't about watching them suffer in dramatic ways. It was about stepping out of a structure that only worked because I stayed inside. And once I left, it stopped working entirely.